protecting the freedom of speech, is protecting the freedom of the press, and is protecting us from the government who's in the position to lock it all down.
Social media is the town square for much of America, but should companies be allowed to shut down viewpoints of certain users? Joining us now, Carl Szabo, the lead counsel for a group called NetChoice. Carl, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, this is an impulse, I think, that a lot of Americans feel. Anytime I'm scrolling through social media sites, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, I'll come across something that just absolutely outrages me, whether it's profanity or just some political idea that's completely contrary to normalcy. I'll look at it and say, why isn't the government getting involved in this? Why don't they shut this kind of talk down? And then rationality eventually overtakes my thinking. I said, no, you don't want the government to get involved in this. And that's really what you're all about, right?
Yeah, just like you, I'm a conservative, I'm an originalist, and when I see content moderation decisions by technology businesses that I don't like, it upsets me, it frustrates me. But then, just like you, I let the rational side of my brain take over and realize, wait a minute, we don't want the government coming in and telling anyone, you, me, or a private business to do or say something that it just doesn't want to do. We've seen how that plays out. We've seen how it plays out in the courts when the state of Colorado tries to force a baker to bake a cake that they don't want to bake. When the Biden administration tries to force Hobby Lobby to provide contraceptions when they don't want to do it because it violates their morals. So we've seen the government efforts to try and force businesses and individuals to say things that they just don't want to say. And we realize that it's better off leaving it up to the business or the user to decide what's best for them and their users, as opposed to turning it over to the government, because the government will just force us to do stuff that we just don't want to do.
That's right. You know what? When I'm facing these kinds of controversies, when we are facing them, I always turn back to history because, as you suggested, this is not a new issue. And I'm going to brag on my family a little bit here because back in the 1950s, my grandfather was president of the Associated Press. And during the McCarthy era, when people were talking about all kinds of censorship, and the government was talking about censorship, he wrote this in a speech. I'll read it to you, and I want to get your reaction to it. He says, "The concept in any form of a referee or a policeman sitting in judgment upon the performance of the press and seeking to enforce that judgment is fundamentally opposed to the concept of press freedom." Your reaction?
I mean, that's exactly right. What we're talking about here is the right of websites to decide what type of content they can host and what type of content they are required to host. And let's take a moment and think about this. Now, when we talk about social media, we typically think what? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. But there are a lot of other websites out there that get impacted by this type of approach. It's websites like Etsy would have to host political speech. That doesn't make any sense. Etsy's all about selling me goods and services. It would require eBay, likewise, to host political speech. It would require Uber to host political speech. And none of that makes any sense because that's not what's right for their users. And at the same time, it would require them to host awful but lawful content. And we're talking about stuff like terrorist recruitment, child grooming. We're talking about stuff like animal abuse. All the stuff that we don't want to see, and we want to empower the business to make a decision. Now, going to the news angle, we actually base our case heavily on a case involving the Miami Herald, where the state of Florida, once again, tried to force the Miami Herald to carry content and opinion editorial that they didn't want to carry. And the Supreme Court said, look, Miami Herald has a First Amendment right, and the government cannot force them to say or publish something that they don't want to say or publish. Same thing's true offline as it is online. And that's exactly what we're looking at right here. It's protecting the freedom of speech. It's protecting the freedom of the press, and it's protecting us from the government who's in the position to lock it all down.
Of special note to viewers of this particular network, this is a really slippery slope because once you get cases of the government cracking down on free speech or press reports that they don't like, it's a next step to crack down on religions they don't like or church services they don't like. And that's a pressing issue right today because we do have cases where the Biden administration has been leaning heavily on social media companies. We now know this from Freedom of Information requests to spin things or to censor certain people. We just don't want it. You're involved in that, correct?
So there's actually two lawsuits being brought. One is by the Missouri and Louisiana state attorney generals against the Biden administration itself for trying to coerce and force social media platforms to remove content that the Biden administration doesn't like. And this isn't new. We saw this a couple months ago. The Biden administration tried to create a disinformation governance board and put somebody who was akin to Mary Poppins in charge of it. And that's the type of 1984 dystopian nightmare that we cannot allow. Because likewise, this administration, we've seen time and time again, has a war against any speech that could be threatening or insensitive. And to them, a lot of religious speech falls under that category. So if you're going to hand over the keys to the kingdom, the power to decide what is or is not allowed online to the Biden administration or any government, that's really dangerous. Because at the end of the day, if I don't like what Facebook or Twitter or YouTube are doing, I'll just go to a different site or service. Rumble went public just the other week with over 80 million users. Truth Social's on the rise. Substack. Lots of alternatives out there. But the one thing I can't easily leave is the United States of America. And that's why we at NetChoice are standing strong against this type of government-controlled speech. Because we know, even though it may be somebody we like today, it very likewise can be somebody we dislike tomorrow, telling us what we have to say and what we can't say.
You know, the best antidote to speech you don't like is more speech. That old truism really holds true in this day and age. Carl Szabo of NetChoice, thanks for the great work you're doing out there. Really appreciate it, and thanks for coming on Centerpoint with us tonight.